Okay, so we're talking about stream ecosystem function, well, freshwater ecosystem function, but I will focus mainly on streams. And this is just to get us started, the big questions in life. I just want to thank Jim Elser for noticing this in the funnies. And then I found it in my local paper, and thanks to Greg Evans, the comic, for tackling this big existential question. When does a puddle become a pond? When does a stream become a river? All right, so these are different ecosystems, right? An ecosystem is a hierarchically organized community that includes producers, consumers, and decomposers, all in one given area, interacting with one another, and also interacting with their abiotic or non-living environment. So weather, earth, sun, soil, climate, and atmosphere. We can measure fluxes of energy, carbon, and nutrients into and out of ecosystems. And some of the first work was done by a student named Lindemann in 1942. So this is all stemming from work in Western ecology from the very early 1900s, when we first started coming up with a more holistic view of ecology and ecosystems. Real fast, we'll talk about an ecosystem that doesn't often get a lot of coverage, which is called the riparian ecosystem. The word riparian comes from ripa, which is Latin for riverbank. And this is similar to lacustrine, which is a word that's an analogous term for the environment along the edge of a lake. So riparian is the forested or grassland environment along the edge of a river. And lacustrine is the word for the forested or terrestrial environment along the edge of a lake. It is a quintessential ecotone. There's a very sharp boundary between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, but we've also learned that that boundary is in flux and changes, and at certain times is less of a boundary. So this kind of like understanding systems like riparian zones, you need to integrate forest ecology, stream ecology, landscape ecology, chemistry, all of these things to really understand how a riparian zone works. So some of the key things that occur in riparian zones is that tree roots can stabilize stream banks, as shown here. There is a huge amount of woody debris. So that's my friend Shannon on a log out in the middle of a debris flow. This happened in Capitol Forest in about 2007. So large amounts of woody debris can enter streams through these riparian forests. And then they provide a really important shading to streams. They keep temperatures cool through evapotranspiration. And then there's some really interesting examples of how important terrestrial insects are to streams, just the bugs that fall off of leaves, and how important leaf litter inputs are. So we'll talk about all of these things in more detail. One of the first most important things to understand when you're thinking about ecosystems is how much biomass is in an ecosystem, how much producer biomass versus secondary consumer biomass. It's important to understand biomass and production at different trophic levels. How much primary production does it take to produce, a certain amount of biomass for top predators, for example. And so I just want you to recall the biomass pyramids that we talked about in earlier lectures, where only about 10% of the energy transfers up. And so you get this really steep pyramid. So biomass is an amount, like how much green stuff is there in a system. And production is a rate. So how much biomass is produced over a given period of time. And so people get biomass and production mixed up all the time, but it's really important to understand the difference. And there's also a ratio, the P to B ratio. The production to biomass ratio is a reflection of the metabolic activity per unit biomass, or the relative efficiency. So if it takes a very small amount of productivity to make a lot of biomass, you have a very productive system, versus the opposite, if it takes a lot of production to produce a small amount of biomass. And then just one more time, in case these words elude you, allochthonous energy is energy that originates from outside of the ecosystem and is dropped into the system, versus autochthonous energy is energy that's produced within the system. And so those words become more important as we think about ecosystems and cross-ecosystem studies. So again, this is a little bit of a review, but just remember there's a lot of ways that streams and forests can interact with one another. So we can't just study them in isolation. So streams export a lot of insects into forests. They provide habitat for these larval stages of insects that are important to the forest. They provide water sources and groundwater recharge to forested systems. They transport materials out of systems, process waste, and then spiral nutrients downstream. And conversely, the forest can influence the stream in a variety of ways. The type of forest can influence forest floor runoff and water chemistry. Again, the forest is providing habitat for these adult stages of aquatic insects. Terrestrial insect inputs we talked about, shading and cooling, things like invasive species invasions can influence how the terrestrial landscape influences the aquatic landscape. And then things like evapotranspiration, woody debris inputs, and leaf litter inputs. So I'm going to come back to subsidies in the next lecture.